Hey, what is up everyone? Today we got a pretty unique story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. Get cozy and watch till the end, guys.
There is a moment, somewhere deep in the lore of Warhammer 40,000, where the line between hero and horror becomes so thin you can see right through it. Where the light of loyalty and the shadow of mutation press so close together that they almost become the same thing. And it is in that exact liminal space, that strange, uneasy place between sanctioned warrior and condemned abomination, that the Black Dragons have made their home for centuries upon centuries. Welcome back. Settle in. Let this wash over you. Today, we are going somewhere the Inquisition would rather you didn't. We are going to look closely, and I mean really closely, at one of the most visually striking, narratively rich, and genuinely unsettling Loyalist chapters in all of the 41st Millennium. A chapter that is undeniably devoted to the Emperor, and a chapter that bleeds for him, fights for him, and has never once wavered in its allegiance to the Imperium of mankind. And yet, a chapter that the Inquisition watches with something that goes well beyond suspicion. A chapter that has been placed on watch lists. A chapter whose very existence raises questions so uncomfortable that some of the most powerful figures in imperial politics would rather simply make the problem disappear than sit with the discomfort of actually answering those questions honestly. The Black Dragons are, in so many ways, a story about what happens when the machinery of the Space Marine process produces something it was never designed to produce. Or what happens when the sacred gene seed, that ancient biological inheritance passed down from the Primarchs themselves, decides to express itself in ways that nobody planned for, nobody wanted, and nobody quite knows how to deal with. What happens when your greatest warriors begin to grow bone? Not in the usual places, not in the quiet internal architecture of an enhanced skeleton doing its quiet job inside the walls of flesh, but erupting outward, through the skin of their foreheads, through the backs of their hands, through the flesh of their arms, pushing through ceramite hard plates of calcified tissue into the open air, forming blades and spurs and protrusions that turn them into something that looks, in the half-light of a ruined city, less like a warrior of the Imperium and more like a creature from a nightmare older than the Imperium itself. And yet, they serve. And yet, they endure. And yet, when the call comes and the enemy masses on the horizon, it is the Black Dragons who step forward, who raise those strange, monstrous limbs, who level those bone blades at things that genuinely terrify most of humanity, and who advance without hesitation into the howling dark. That, if anything, is the heart of why this chapter matters so much to people who spend time thinking about 40,000 lore, because they force you to sit with a question that the Imperium itself has never fully answered. A question that the Inquisition dances around but cannot resolve. A question that cuts to the very core of what it means to be a Space Marine, what it means to be loyal, and what it means to be human in a universe that has very strong and very loudly expressed opinions about what humanity should and should not look like. The question is this: at what point does a mutation stop being a flaw in an otherwise loyal servant and start being evidence of something dangerous enough to warrant destruction? The Black Dragons have been living inside that question for a very long time, and the way they have chosen to answer it, or rather, the way they have chosen not to answer it explicitly, the way they have leaned into their otherness and weaponized it against the enemies of mankind, is something worth spending time with, worth understanding properly, worth appreciating in the quiet, unhurried way that a story like this one genuinely deserves. So let us begin at the beginning. Or as close to the beginning as the fragmentary, often deliberately obscured records of the Imperium allow us to get. Because those records are, as they so often are in the 41st Millennium, incomplete in ways that are partly accidental and partly the result of parties with agendas doing deliberate work to make sure certain things stay obscured. What we can say before anything else is that the Black Dragons exist in a universe where information about chapter origins is frequently incomplete, occasionally contradictory, and sometimes redacted entirely. This is worth keeping in your mind as we move through their history, because some of what we know about them comes from sources that have every reason to frame them in the worst possible light. Inquisitorial reports. Assessments from parties whose institutional interest is in finding reasons for concern rather than reasons for confidence. And some of what we know comes from sources that have every reason to downplay the genuine strangeness at the heart of their existence. From the chapter's own records and traditions, shaped by warriors who have understandable motivations to present themselves as unremarkably loyal, rather than as fascinating and troubling outliers. As always in 40K lore, the truth is somewhere in the middle, and it is almost certainly more interesting than either extreme. What we can say with confidence is that the Black Dragons are one of the Imperium's stranger success stories. A chapter that, by any reasonable measure, then should have been destroyed long ago by an inquisition that has ended the existence of chapters for far less than what the Black Dragons carry in their gene seed. And yet they persist. They fight. They win. And every time the Inquisition looks hard at them and weighs the cost of eliminating them against the benefit of keeping them pointed at the galaxy's worst threats, the calculus comes out the same way. The Black Dragons are useful, terrifyingly, monstrously, undeniably useful. And in the grim darkness of the far future, usefulness is very nearly indistinguishable from virtue. There is something almost elegant about that. The way effectiveness becomes its own argument for existence. The way centuries of battlefield performance accumulate into a kind of institutional equity, and a running total of service rendered that sits on one side of the scales and has to be weighed against whatever discomfort the chapter's mutations create on the other. The Black Dragons understand this calculation. They have been living inside it for as long as they have existed as a chapter, and it has shaped them in ways that go far beyond simple military effectiveness into something more interesting and more psychologically complex than most accounts of them tend to capture. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Before we can understand what the Black Dragons have become, we need to understand what they were made from. And that means starting where all Space Marine chapters start, with the gene seed, the founding, and the particular circumstances of their creation. Section 2. Origins and Founding. Who made the Black Dragons and why it matters? To understand the Black Dragons, you have to understand the context in which they were born. And that context is one of the most dramatic, turbulent, and consequential periods in the entire history of the Imperium of mankind. A period that left its mark on the chapters it created in ways that have echoed down through 10,000 years of Imperial history. The Space Marine chapters that exist in the 41st millennium are not all of a single age. They did not all spring into existence at the same moment in some grand act of simultaneous creation. The process by which new chapters are created, the foundings as they are known, has happened repeatedly across those 10,000 years of history, each one a deliberate act of institutional creation designed to expand the military capacity of humanity's star-spanning empire. Each founding takes genetic material from existing chapters, from the preserved gene seed of the great primarchs, and uses it to create new brotherhoods of warriors who will go out into the galaxy and fight and die in the Emperor's name. The number of foundings that have occurred, the exact timing of each one, the chapters created within each, the specific administrative machinery that authorized and oversaw them. All of these details are matters of ongoing scholarly discussion and significant gaps in the publicly available record. Some foundings are well documented, others are almost entirely obscure, and some are documented in ways that are themselves problematic. Because the parties responsible for maintaining those records have had their own reasons to shape what is and is not preserved. The Black Dragons are believed to be products of the 21st founding. And if that number means nothing to you yet, let me explain why it should mean quite a lot. Because the 21st founding is not just a date and a number in the administrative history of the Adeptus Astartes. It is something that has acquired a a name that reflects something real and deeply troubling about what happened when that particular batch of Space Marine chapters came into being. The 21st founding is known, in the darkly whimsical way that Imperial scholars sometimes name things that they are uncomfortable looking at directly, as the Cursed Founding. This is not hyperbole. This is not the kind of grandiose title that gets attached to things for dramatic effect, or to make them sound more interesting to future generations. It is a name that reflects something real about the experience of the chapters that came out of it. Almost every chapter created during the 21st founding emerged with some kind of genetic irregularity, some flaw, some deviation, some mutation in their gene seed that made them different from their parent chapters in ways that ranged from mildly unusual to genuinely alarming. The exact nature of these deviations varies enormously from chapter to chapter. Some Cursed Founding chapters developed psychological quirks. Some developed physical differences that were subtle enough to be overlooked, or at least tolerated, by the monitoring bodies responsible for chapter oversight. Some developed traits so extreme that they were destroyed almost immediately upon their creation, their gene seed quarantined, their records sealed, their existence reduced to a data point in a file that very few people are cleared to read. The chapters that survived the 21st founding survived largely because their deviations, whatever form those deviations took, did not prevent them from being effective warriors, and because the Imperium, even the Inquisition, is ultimately a pragmatic institution when it needs to be. The Black Dragons survived because their deviation, while deeply unsettling by almost any standard, did not compromise their loyalty, did not send them spiraling into chaos worship or Xenos corruption or the kind of ideological fracture that has destroyed other chapters. And it enhanced their lethality in specific and useful ways. And it expressed itself in something that was strange and alarming, but that had no reliable connection to the warp, to corruption, to any of the specifically spiritual threats that the Inquisition is most obligated to respond to with extreme prejudice, which is the kind of outcome that allows a lot of sins to be overlooked, at least provisionally, at least as long as the battlefield record continues to justify the tolerance. Now, the specific details of who authorized the Black Dragon's creation, which adept of the Adeptus Mechanicus oversaw their gene seed cultivation, what the original intentions for them were, what the initial assessment of the mutation was when it first expressed itself clearly enough to be identified. These things are not clearly recorded, or if they are recorded, those records are not publicly accessible. What we know is that the chapter draws its genetic lineage from the Ultramarines, which is itself significant in ways that deserve careful consideration. The Ultramarines are arguably the most stable, most carefully documented, most thoroughly studied gene seed line in the entire Imperium. Reboot Guilliman's genetic material has been copied more times than any other Primarchs, and the chapters descended from the Ultramarines are numerous enough to form what is sometimes called the Ultramarines' successors, a broad lineage of chapters that includes some of the most celebrated and respected brotherhoods in the Adeptus Astartes. The Ultramarines' gene seed is the gold standard, the reference point, the thing you compare everything else against when you're trying to assess the health and stability of other genetic lines. This makes the Black Dragon's mutation particularly interesting and particularly vexing to the Inquisition, because if a gene seed as well documented and carefully monitored as the Ultramarine line can produce something like the Black Dragons, then what does that say about the fundamental stability of the Space Marine process itself? What does it suggest about the long-term genetic health of the chapters built upon that foundation? What does it imply about the assumption that sufficiently careful management of gene seed will produce predictable, controllable results over the long timescales involved? These are the kinds of questions that keep certain inquisitors awake, as staring at the ceiling of their personal chambers in the small hours of the ship's cycle, running through probabilities they don't much like the look of, and arriving at conclusions they are not eager to share with anyone else. The name the chapter took for itself is worth pausing on, because names in 40K are rarely arbitrary. Black Dragons, not simply Black Marines, or some reference to the world they were assigned, or some straightforward echo of their parent chapter. Dragons, creatures of ancient myth, creatures defined by their scales, their fire, their terrible power, and in many of the traditions from which old Earth mythology drew, their fundamental otherness, their being apart from the natural order. Dragons are not tame things. They are not domesticated things. They are wild, ancient, powerful, and dangerous. And the civilizations that built legends around them were never quite sure whether to worship them or flee from them. Dragons occupied a category of their own, not fully animal, not fully divine, not human, but not alien, in the way that truly incomprehensible things are alien. It is not hard to see why a chapter defined by monstrous physical traits, a chapter already aware from its earliest days that it stood apart from its brothers in the wider Adeptus Astartes, would choose a name that leaned into that apartness, that claimed it, that transformed it from a mark of shame or inadequacy into something more like an identity, a declaration. We are not trying to look like you. We are something else, something powerful and old and difficult to categorize, something that belongs to its own category. What the chapter was assigned to what would become their recruiting grounds and eventual home, a world that we will discuss in more detail in its own section, and they began doing what Space Marine chapters do. They recruited, they trained, they deployed, they fought. And as the generations passed and the gene seed moved through successive waves of recruits, the mutations that had been present, but perhaps not fully expressed in the founding generation, began to emerge with greater and greater clarity and consistency. The os modular, one of the 19 standard Space Marine implants, the one responsible for bone growth and skeletal reinforcement, was doing something in these warriors that it was not supposed to do. And what it was doing was, depending entirely on your perspective, either extraordinary or deeply troubling, usually both. Septimus Section 3. The os modular and the gift that became a curse. To properly appreciate what makes the Black Dragons physically remarkable, you need to know something about the biological machinery that transforms an ordinary human recruit into a Space Marine. Not everything, because the full process is genuinely lengthy and intricate enough to fill its own dedicated examination, but enough to understand what specifically has gone wrong, or right, or both simultaneously, depending on your moral and institutional position. In the case of the Black Dragons, when a candidate is accepted into a Space Marine chapter and begins the long, painful, genuinely transformative process of becoming an Astartes, they receive a series of implants, 19 of them, in the standard Codex-compliant process. Each one is a piece of engineered biology designed to fundamentally alter the human body in specific, carefully controlled ways. The Biscopia enhances muscle growth to degrees that no natural organism achieves. The Hemastamen alters the blood, making it more resilient and efficient. The Betcher's gland, sitting in the cheek, allows the marine to spit acid powerful enough to corrode metal. The Preomnor modifies the stomach and digestive system to handle substances that would kill an ordinary human. The Omophagia allows the Astartes to absorb genetic memory from consuming the flesh of enemies or prey. Each implant has a specific function, and the process is designed so that each one integrates with the others in a cascade of transformation that produces, at the end of a process measured in years, something that is far more than human and that is built, in every dimension of its existence, for war. The os medulla is the implant responsible for bone. Specifically, it is a small gland implanted within the body that releases hormones causing the recruit's skeletal structure to dramatically accelerate its growth and densification. The bones of a Space Marine are not simply harder versions of human bones. They are something fundamentally different in quality, stronger than ceramite in some configurations, capable of resisting impacts that would shatter the skeleton of any ordinary human, bound together by a dense mineral lattice that makes the Marine's body a formidable weapon even before he picks up a bolter or a blade. This process also fuses the ribcage into a solid, nearly impenetrable breastbone, and reinforces the skeletal architecture in ways that make a fully realized Astartes physically durable to a degree that has to be witnessed to be properly appreciated. In most chapters, the os modular does its work in a relatively controlled way. The bones grow, they densify, they harden. The skeleton becomes what the process was designed to make it. And then the hormonal activity stabilizes, reaching an equilibrium that it maintains for the rest of the warrior's life. Typically, a very long life, measured in centuries rather than decades. The whole system is designed to be, if not subtle, then at least contained. The transformation is interior. The result is invisible from outside, hidden behind layers of flesh and armor. In the Black Dragons, the os modular does not stabilize in the same way. What happens instead is that in a significant proportion of Black Dragon warriors, not all of them, which is itself interesting and something we will return to, the os modular continues to drive bone growth beyond the interior of the body, beyond the skeleton's normal confines, beyond the skin. The bones grow outward, through the skin, breaking through the surface of the body in a way that is, by any ordinary biological standard, deeply wrong. The medical terminology for external bone protrusions in ordinary humans, exostoses, osteochondromas, various other pathological designations, does not quite capture what happens to the Black Dragons, because in ordinary humans, these conditions are pathological precisely because the body is not designed for them and the results are debilitating. In the Black Dragons, the body has adapted. The os modular's aberrant behavior has been incorporated over generations into a biological system that has made space for it. The skin around the growth points thickens and hardens. The surrounding musculature adjusts. The warrior's enhanced pain tolerance and healing capacity mean that the process of emergence, while almost certainly uncomfortable, does not incapacitate him. The most dramatic manifestation of this is on the skull. Black dragons who experience this mutation, and it tends to emerge as the marine ages and his service accumulates, becoming more pronounced over the decades, develop bony protrusions from their forehead and the top and sides of their skull. These grow above the ears, above the eyes, from the crown, from various points across the cranial surface. They are not soft growths, and they are not cartilaginous or flexible like the structures of a developing organism. They are hard bone, calcium white, or sometimes a deeper ivory color, erupting through the skin in spurs and ridges and plates that give the marine's face, when his helmet is removed, a distinctly draconic quality. In the most extreme cases, which appear in the most veteran warriors after the longest service, these growths can be genuinely elaborate, forming curved structures that look almost like horns, or like the bony crests of some ancient creature preserved in amber in a museum that no longer exists. And then there are the hands. This is the mutation that the Black Dragons have most thoroughly incorporated into their combat style, and with good reason. The bone growths on the hands are not cosmetic. They are not simply aesthetic expressions of a malfunctioning biological system. They are, functionally, weapons. Growing from the backs of the hands and the forearms, these protrusions can reach several inches in length. They are shaped, by the particular way the os modular drives them, into something resembling blades. Long, sharp-edged structures of dense bone that emerge between the knuckles and along the forearm, giving the marine's unarmed strike a lethality that goes well beyond what even standard space marine strength would provide. Think about what it means to be hit by a space marine fist. The enhanced musculature, the reinforced skeleton behind it, the mass of an armored warrior moving at full speed. That is already something that can kill most things in the galaxy without additional enhancement. And now put several inches of dense bone blade on the back of that fist. Now the same strike that would break bone becomes one that opens flesh and severs tissue, in addition to applying the impact force. The bone blades transform the hand from a bludgeoning weapon into something that combines bludgeoning and cutting, in a package that is always attached to the warrior, cannot be dropped or disarmed, and does not run out of ammunition. These are what the Black Dragons call their bone blades, informally, and what their enemies describe, on the rare occasions when they survive long enough to describe anything, in considerably more alarmed terms. Now here is where things get genuinely fascinating, from a biological standpoint, because the black dragons have not simply accepted these growths passively, but they have adapted to them in a way that reflects something important about the chapter's character. The growths do not simply appear and stay static. They grow over time as the osmodula continues its aberrant activity, and the black dragons have found ways to shape them, to file them, to maintain them the way a warrior might maintain a precious blade or a weapon gifted by a mentor. There are accounts of battle brothers who have developed something close to a craft tradition around the management of their bone growths, treating the sharpening and grooming of these natural weapons with the same careful attention that another marine might give to a relic blade or a master-crafted bolter. This is not vanity. This is not the narcissism of creatures in love with their own strangeness. This is practical. A blade that is not maintained is a blade that is less effective. A weapon that is allowed to grow without direction will grow in directions that serve the weapon rather than the warrior. The black dragons have understood this from early in their history, and they have developed practices around it that have accumulated over generations into something that looks very much like a tradition. The mutation also raises questions that remain genuinely unresolved in the available lore, which is characteristic of the best 40K mysteries. Why does the osmodula behave this way specifically in the black dragons? Is it a flaw introduced during the original gene seed cultivation? Something that was present from the beginning, but not fully expressed until the gene seed had propagated through enough generations? Is it a more fundamental instability in some subset of the ultramarine genetic line that the black dragons happen to inherit? Is it the result of some interaction between the gene seed and the specific population of humans from which the chapter recruits? Some quality of the gene pool on their homeworld that interacts with the implant in unusual ways? Or is there something more subtle at work? Something in the accumulated history of the chapter's deployments, the worlds they have fought on, the energies they have been exposed to? The Adeptus Mechanicus, who are responsible for the monitoring and preservation of chapter gene seed across the Imperium, have opinions on this. Their opinions are, as is frequently the case with the Mechanicus, partially technical and partially doctrinal, and partially the result of years of accumulated observation that has not produced a clean answer. They have not condemned the Black Dragon's gene seed as irreparably corrupt. They continue to monitor it, more frequently and more rigorously than is standard for most chapters. Whether they have arrived at a genuine understanding of what is happening at the biological level, or whether they are simply maintaining the monitoring program because the alternative is making a formal judgment they are not prepared to make, is another question. What the Mechanicus has not done, which is perhaps the most important thing about their position, is declare the gene seed unfit for continued propagation. That declaration would effectively end the chapter. No gene seed means no new recruits. Means no continuation, means dissolution within a generation or two. The fact that they have not made it is, in itself, a kind of provisional endorsement. Not enthusiastic, not without reservations, but sufficient to keep the chapter's biological future open. That openness is not something the Black Dragons take for granted. Section 4. What the mutations actually look like. Bone blades and dragon helms in detail. Let us spend real time with the visual reality of the Black Dragons, because this is a chapter that is defined as much by how it looks as by what it does. And because understanding the physical appearance of these warriors, really understanding it, with the kind of specific detail that moves it from abstraction to something you can picture clearly, is essential to understanding how the rest of the galaxy responds to them. Picture a space marine. Hold the standard image in your mind. The massive armored form, the broad-shouldered silhouette, the helmet with its glowing lenses, the bolter held in gauntleted hands. The controlled, disciplined posture of a being that has been engineered for war and has spent decades learning how to inhabit that engineering without being consumed by it. The colors vary by chapter, but the essential form is familiar. Powerful, martial, inhuman, if only just barely, in the way that all space marines are inhuman. in the way that something built to such extreme specifications occupies a category just at the edge of what the human eye reads as human. Now take that image and begin to modify it. The black dragons wear armor that is predominantly black. Not the flat, unreflective black of simply painted ceramite, but a deep, a slightly lustrous shade that catches light differently depending on the angle and the quality of the light source. Somewhere between the black of deep space and the dark iridescence of a raven's wing when it catches sunlight from exactly the right direction. Against this darkness, the bone white of their mutation is extraordinarily striking. The growths, when visible, when not concealed by the helmet or obscured by shadow, catch light in a way that the armor itself does not. They have the quality of things that belong to a different category from metal and synthetic materials. Because they do. They are biological. They are alive. They grew from the marine's own body. The helmet is its own story. And it deserves its own careful consideration because the black dragons have made specific choices about how to present the mutation within their armor rather than concealing it. Many Space Marine chapters would, if their warriors developed external bone protrusions, modify their armor to minimize the visual impact, to build helms that concealed the growths, that maintained the standard silhouette, that allowed the chapter to present itself as visually indistinguishable from a compliant Codex chapter, except for the color scheme. The black dragons have not done this. Their helmets, particularly those worn by veteran warriors and dragon claws, have been developed as variants on the standard pattern that accommodate, and in many cases actively display, the bone growths that emerge from the skull. Some versions have cutouts or raised sections that allow prominent cranial protrusions to project through the helm itself, so that even in full battle armor, even with the helmet sealed and the lenses glowing, even at the moment when the Marine's identity is most thoroughly subsumed within the anonymous silhouette of the Astartes, the mutation remains visible. The bones emerge from the top and sides of the helm, creating a silhouette that is unlike any other chapters, immediately recognizable to anyone who has encountered the black dragons before, immediately alarming to anyone who has not. In artistic representations of the chapter, and the black dragons have inspired a great deal of visual art, both official and fan-created, because they offer an extraordinary canvas for artists interested in the boundary between the human and the monstrous. The helmeted face of a fully armored black dragon warrior reads as something caught between a space marine and a creature from ancient myth. The helm takes on a draconic quality, partly by deliberate design choice in how the armor has been shaped, and partly because the bone growths naturally create a shape that the human visual processing system pattern matches to the skulls and crests of large reptilian creatures. It is a remarkable effect, and it is almost certainly at least partially intentional. The black dragons have had long enough to think about what they look like. They have made choices. When a black dragon removes his helmet, and this is a moment that carries specific weight in any encounter, because you are about to see what the armor has been framing. The mutation is at its most visible and its most striking. The face of a veteran warrior, someone who has served for decades and whose os modular has had long years to express itself without constraint, can be genuinely extraordinary in the clinical sense of that word. The brow ridges are often heavily reinforced by bone, giving the warrior a heavy, brooding, intense appearance even in repose. The protrusions from the skull vary enormously in size and arrangement from warrior to warrior, from small ridge-like structures along the temples to substantial curved growths that arch above the head like natural architecture. The skin around these growth points is typically scarred and thickened, hardened by years of the bone pushing through it and the body's continuous attempts to adapt to this persistent process. The eyes of a black dragon veteran are often described in accounts as intense, as watchful, as carrying a quality of attention that is unusual even by Astartes standards. This may be partly because the bony structures around them create a natural shadowing effect that gives the eyes an unusual quality in certain lighting conditions, making them seem to recede into shadow or to catch light unexpectedly. Or it may be that warriors who carry an obvious mutation in a universe with very strong opinions about mutation develop a particular quality of watchfulness over the years of their service, an awareness that they are being looked at and assessed, not simply as warriors, but as biological phenomena, in a way that most of their fellow Astartes are not. That kind of sustained attention tends to produce a reciprocal quality of attentiveness. The watched become watchers. The hands. Let us return to the hands, because this is where the mutation is most operationally significant. Extend your hand, look at the back of it, at the landscape of knuckles and tendons, and the slight ridges where bones press close to the skin. Now imagine that from between those knuckles, from the bones themselves, structures of dense calcium white bone are growing. Flat, wide at the base, narrowing toward a tip that years of careful maintenance have kept sharp. Growing outward from the hand at angles, shaped partly by the bone's natural growth direction and partly by deliberate sculpting over time. Several inches in length on a mature protrusion. On a veteran warrior, potentially longer. Extend that same image to the forearm. Additional growths along the dorsal surface, angled backward in some configurations, oriented to add cutting force to a forward strike, or to make a defensive raised arm more dangerous to an opponent who tries to grab it. Each warrior's growths are subtly individual, shaped by both biology and by the choices made in their maintenance over the years. No two black dragon warriors' bone blades are precisely alike. They are, in this way, as individual as the warriors who carry them. The gauntlets of black dragon armor accommodate this, not by concealing the growths. Again, the chapter has not chosen concealment, but by working around them. Some configurations have cutouts in the ceramite that allow the bone blades to project through the armor, and so that even in full battle dress, the natural weapons are accessible. Others simply accommodate the growths within the internal volume of an enlarged gauntlet, designed with the mutation in mind. Either way, the functional result is that a black dragon in full armor who has developed significant bone blade growth is a warrior whose unarmed offensive capability goes considerably beyond what standard power armor and standard Astartes strength already provide. The overall visual effect of a full formation of black dragon warriors in the field is, by any account, deeply unsettling to anyone who encounters them for the first time. Even to allies, even to other space marines who know intellectually what the black dragons are and have no reason to be afraid of them. Well, there is something in the human visual processing system that reads the combination of their coloring, their armor, and their mutations as a threat signal that is difficult to consciously override. The black armor that absorbs light, the bone growths that catch it, the draconic helmet silhouette, the way they move, which is not materially different from how any other fully armored Astartes moves, but which seems different because of everything surrounding it. Soldiers who have fought alongside the black dragons in extended campaigns report that you do eventually habituate to the sight of them, that the bone protrusions and draconic helms become simply part of the visual landscape of the battlefield, markers of the warriors fighting beside you, rather than things to be afraid of. Well, that after a while, you stop seeing the mutations and start seeing the Marines. But that first encounter, that first time you see them move through smoke and ruin, the bone growths catching whatever light finds them, the black armor absorbing everything around them. That first time a Dragonclaw removes his helmet and looks at you with those shadowed, watchful eyes. That, by all accounts, stays with you for a very long time. Section 5. The Dragonclaws. The chapter's most fearsome formation. Within the broader structure of the Black Dragons chapter, one particular category of warrior deserves its own dedicated attention before we move on to the political dimensions of the chapter's existence. Because the Dragonclaws are not simply the chapter's most visually extreme members, but they are the most tactically significant expression of what the Black Dragons are and what they have chosen to become. The Dragonclaws are the warriors whose bone mutations have progressed to the point where their natural weapons are genuinely combat capable, where the blades are long enough, dense enough, and sharp enough to function as primary close combat tools, rather than simply as incidental features of an already dangerous opponent. They are organized into specific formations within the chapter's order of battle, assigned to operations and positions where their particular capabilities are most effectively deployed, and they are in many ways the defining image of the chapter when it comes to battle.
Okay, I just want to step out of lore for just a second, because honestly, the Black Dragons are one of those chapters that I came back to multiple times before making this video. The first time I looked into them, I thought, okay, bone mutations, cool visual, interesting political drama with the Inquisition, standard cursed chapter stuff. But the more time I spent with them, the more something about them just stuck with me, because they're not tragic in the way a lot of mutant chapters are framed. They didn't spiral, they didn't break, they just decided that what they are is worth being in a universe that is constantly telling them it's not. And I find that genuinely compelling, more compelling honestly than a lot of the cleaner, more celebrated chapters. There's something about choosing loyalty when the institution you are loyal to is not sure that it wants you that hits differently than just being a hero, because that is what you were made for. But anyways, that's just my take. Let's go back to the video.
But to understand the Dragon Claws properly, you need to understand the selection process that produces them. And that process is not simply a matter of identifying warriors whose mutations are the most extreme and assigning them to the formation. It is considerably more nuanced than that. And the nuance reflects something important about how the chapter thinks about its mutation. Not every black dragon develops significant external bone growths. Some warriors serve their entire careers with minimal external manifestation of the os modula's aberrant behavior. Their bones may be unusually dense internally, and there may be small ridges and protrusions that are noticeable to a careful observer, but they do not develop the dramatic blade structures that characterize the dragon claws. Others develop the growth steadily over the first decades of their service and reach a stable expression level that is significant but not extreme. And then there are those in whom the mutation expresses itself more aggressively, whose bones grow faster and longer, and whose external protrusions become genuinely substantial over relatively short periods of service. The chapter monitors this progression in all of its warriors, continuously and carefully. There is institutional knowledge within the chapter about which warriors are likely to develop significant expressions of the mutation, based on a combination of observation, the records of previous generations, and whatever understanding the chapter's apothecaries and internal specialists have developed over the centuries. Warriors whose mutations are progressing toward Dragonclaw level expressions are not simply left to discover this on their own. They are guided through the process, or given access to the traditions and practices that have been developed for managing the growth, and eventually formally transitioned into the Dragonclaw formations when their natural weapons have reached a point of combat utility. This transition is marked by ceremony within the chapter's culture, in ways that the chapter has been careful not to document in any form that might reach inquisitorial observers. The details of these ceremonies are not publicly available, but the function they serve is clear enough. They mark the warrior's formal adoption of what he has become, his acceptance of the role that his biology has prepared him for, his acknowledgement that he is now a Dragonclaw, and that this carries specific obligations and specific honors. In battle, the Dragonclaws operate as shock troops in the most literal and visceral sense of that term. Their deployment is designed to maximize the psychological impact of what they are at the moment. That impact is most effective, which is the moment of first contact with the enemy, when the enemy's threat assessment systems are working hardest, and when the disruption of those systems can cascade most productively through the opposing force's command structure and morale. A Dragonclaw, advancing through smoke toward an enemy position, is a sight designed to produce specific neurological responses in the humans or near humans facing it. The combination of the black armor, the draconic helmet, the bone blades, catching light as the warrior moves, and the particular quality of motion that large armored warriors have, rolling, deliberate, and inexorable, adds up to something that the human brain categorizes as a predator, a large, dangerous predator that is coming specifically for you. the kind of threat response that evolution built into the deep architecture of the human nervous system as a survival mechanism. The dragon claws exploit this response deliberately. They have been trained to move in ways that maximize it, to use available light and shadow in ways that amplify the visual impact of their approach, to time their appearance, emerging from smoke, from cover, from the shadows of ruined structures, for maximum effect. They are students of the fear they produce, practitioners of an art that most Space Marine chapters do not need to develop because they do not carry the tools to practice it. In close combat itself, the bone blades are used in coordination with whatever other weapons the warrior carries. Against lightly armored opponents, they can be the primary weapon. Against armored targets where the blades cannot penetrate, they become a secondary tool, used to create openings, to grip and redirect, to add cutting force to impacts that are primarily driven by power armor-assisted strength. The training for their use has been developed over generations by warriors who have had the time to experiment extensively and who have passed their conclusions on through the chapter's combat traditions in ways that a chapter without this specific quality would have no parallel for. Well, there is also something important to understand about the psychological effect of the dragon claws on enemies who are not simply frightened by them, but who are in some sense confused by them. Many of the galaxy's enemies have frameworks for understanding Space Marines, for categorizing them, assessing their capabilities, planning responses. The dragon claws do not fit neatly into those frameworks. They are something else, something that requires a different category, and the cognitive effort of creating that new category is itself a tactical asset. An opponent who is trying to figure out what it is looking at is an opponent who is, briefly, not shooting at you with full efficiency. Section 6. The Inquisition's Gaze. Living under a death sentence. Here is a thought experiment. You are an inquisitor of the Ordo Hereticus, or your mandate is the preservation of the purity of humanity within the Imperium of mankind. You are responsible for the identification and elimination of mutation, heresy, and deviation from the established order. You have the authority to condemn entire planetary populations. You have the power to order the deaths of millions if the situation warrants it. And in the exercise of this authority over the years of your service, you have developed a very clear internal framework for what kinds of things are acceptable and what kinds of things are not. Now someone hands you a comprehensive report about the Black Dragons. The report tells you about the osmodular mutation. It describes the bone growths in clinical detail. It includes records of the mutation becoming more pronounced over successive generations of recruitment, not stabilizing, but not reaching an equilibrium, but continuing to express itself with increasing frequency and intensity as the chapter's gene seed propagates through cohort after cohort of new recruits. It notes that the deviation has now been present for long enough that it cannot be attributed to the specific circumstances of the 21st founding alone. It is baked into the gene seed. It is the gene seed now. The report notes that the chapter has not only failed to suppress or minimize the mutation, but has developed internal practices around the management of it that incorporate it actively into the chapter's combat doctrine. That warriors with the most extreme expressions of the mutation occupy specific formations and honored roles within the chapter structure rather than being treated as unfortunate defectives. That there are ceremonies, the details of which are not fully available, that appear to involve the bone growths in ways that the report's author has declined to characterize precisely, but has flagged as potentially concerning. What do you do with that report? This is not a hypothetical. Versions of this report have been handed to versions of this Inquisitor multiple times over the centuries of the Black Dragon's existence. And the fact that the chapter still exists, the fact that the bone blades are still being grown and sharpened in their fortress monastery, the fact that the dragon claws still march to war and return from it and are celebrated rather than condemned, that fact tells us everything about how those reports have been answered. But it does not tell us that the question has gone away. It has not gone away. What it will never go away, as long as the chapter carries its mutation and the Inquisition carries its mandate. The formal relationship between the Black Dragons and the Inquisition is one of uneasy, negotiated tolerance. The chapter is what is sometimes described as being on the Inquisition's watch list, a formal category that sits somewhere between full inquisitorial sanction, which would mean active proceedings aimed at the chapter's dissolution or censure, and full clearance, which the Black Dragons have never achieved and probably never will so long as the mutation continues. Being on the watch list means that there are inquisitors whose specific brief includes monitoring the chapter's activities and gene seed health. It means that the chapter is subject to more frequent and rigorous gene seed assessment than is standard for most Astartes brotherhoods. It means that the chapter's deployments, its casualties, its recruitment patterns, and its internal organizational structure are all subject to a level of external scrutiny that would be unusual for a chapter with a cleaner record. It also means that the chapter exists under a sword, not quite descending, not quite withdrawn, just hanging there, present, a constant in the background of every decision the chapter's leadership makes, every operation they plan, every warrior they recruit and train. Just reminding everyone involved that the chapter's continued existence is contingent on a calculation that could, at any moment, be run again and produce a different result. Whereas the effect of this on the chapter's culture is profound, and it is worth taking some time with. Imagine what it does to an institution when every member of it grows up understanding that the organization they belong to is viewed with deep suspicion by one of the most powerful forces in the Imperium. When every young recruit who joins the Black Dragons learns, as part of their initiation into the chapter's history and traditions, that they carry a mutation that makes them suspect in ways that their service and their loyalty cannot fully address. That they are warriors of the Emperor who are also, in the eyes of some, a problem to be managed rather than heroes to be celebrated. Different institutions respond to this kind of chronic external pressure in different ways. Some collapse inward into anxiety and defensive minimization, us developing a culture of anxious compliance where the primary goal is to draw as little attention as possible and give the watching eyes nothing to see. Others lean into a kind of siege mentality, fortress culture, deeply suspicious of outsiders, developing in ways that make them more, rather than less, concerning to outside observers over time. Others simply break, fracture internally as the pressure finds the cracks between different factions with different views about how to respond. The Black Dragons have done something considerably more sophisticated than any of these. They have developed a culture that acknowledges the reality of their situation with clarity and without self-deception, but that is not defined by resentment or anxiety. They are loyal to the Emperor. That loyalty is not performative, not the loyalty of a chapter trying to seem compliant while secretly harboring alternative agendas. It is genuine, deep, old, and tested by exactly the kind of sustained pressure that would expose insincerity if insincerity were present. They believe in what they fight for. They believe that the Imperium is worth defending, that the enemies of humanity are real and terrible, and that their particular capabilities, including and especially the capabilities their mutation provides, are genuinely useful in the defense of mankind. At the same time, they are not naive about the threat the Inquisition represents. They know what they look like. They understand what the Inquisition's remit is and how it tends to be applied. And they have made, as a chapter, a collective decision about how to navigate this reality. That decision can be summarized roughly as follows. Be demonstrably, undeniably effective. Be so consistently valuable on the battlefield that the cost of eliminating you always exceeds whatever discomfort your existence causes. Make yourself indispensable in theaters where nothing else will do. Build a record so long and so unambiguously loyal that it crowds out the space where doubt would otherwise live. This is a strategy built on the assumption that effectiveness will continue to outweigh aesthetics in the Inquisition's internal calculations. And in an institution as complex and politically fractured as the Inquisition, where different inquisitors bring wildly different philosophies to their work, whilst where there are standing disputes about methodology and authority and the proper limits of inquisitorial power, there is never any guarantee that the next person to look at the black dragons will share the same pragmatic calculus as the last one. The chapter maintains, not through any official mechanism, but through the informal intelligence networks that every major institution in the Imperium develops over time, an awareness of who in the Inquisition is their friend and who is not. They know which inquisitors have argued internally for their continued existence and which have pushed for more formal investigation. They know when a new inquisitor with a reputation for doctrinal strictness is being assigned to a region that includes their homeworld, and they adjust accordingly, not in ways that would suggest concealment or evasion, but in ways that make the picture the new observer encounters as clean and straightforward as possible. This political sophistication is one of the Black Dragon's most underappreciated qualities. Most Space Marine chapters do not need to be politically sophisticated in this way. Most chapters do not live under the same ongoing uncertainty about whether the institution that they serve will continue to permit their existence. The Black Dragons do need to be sophisticated, and they have become so over centuries of operating at the intersection of military necessity and institutional suspicion. Section 7. Homeworld, Culture, and the Society. They built Space Marine chapters need a home. Not in the sentimental sense, though the emotional dimension is real even within a culture as martial as the Astartes. Or they need a home in the practical sense, a place to recruit, a place to train, a place to return to between campaigns, a place that is theirs and that anchors their identity across centuries of warfare and displacement. The Fortress Monastery is the heart of the chapter, the location where its culture is transmitted from one generation to the next, where its traditions are maintained, its history preserved, and its particular understanding of itself shaped and refined over long years. For the Black Dragons, this place is a world known as Sanctuary, which is, when you think about it, a name that carries more than a little irony, because a world that serves as the home of the Black Dragons is not, in most senses of the word, a sanctuary in the conventional meaning of the term, whilst it is not a place of quiet or of refuge from the world's dangers. It is a place defined by the constant presence of warriors who carry a visible and politically dangerous mutation, who train for war with the same relentless intensity as any Space Marine chapter, and who exist under the ongoing shadow of inquisitorial scrutiny. The name reads less as a description of what the world is, and more as a statement of what the chapter intends it to be, for themselves, for their recruits, for the human population that shares it with them. This is their ground. This is where they belong. This is where they are safe from the consequences of their otherness, in the only sense of safety available to beings like the Black Dragons, in numbers, in walls, in the accumulated weight of their own defenses. The specific geography and physical character of Sanctuary are not extensively documented in publicly accessible sources. The chapter has not been forthcoming about the details of their homeworld in ways that would make it easier for hostile parties to plan operations against it. And this is not paranoia, but prudence from an institution that has spent a long time thinking about the various ways in which its existence might be threatened. What we know is that it supports the chapter's recruitment needs, that it has a human population of sufficient size, density, and genetic compatibility to produce candidates capable of surviving the notoriously demanding selection and augmentation process. The Black Dragons are, despite their mutation, not so far from the standard Astartes template that ordinary human recruits cannot be transformed by the standard implantation sequence. The Os Modular's aberrant behavior is a downstream consequence of an otherwise functional process. The Fortress Monastery itself is, by all accounts, an imposing structure. Space Marine chapters that have a single homeworld and spend centuries on it tend to build things that reflect both their military needs and the particular cultural identity they have developed over that time. The Black Dragons have had a long time to build, and the architectural choices they have made speak to a chapter that is not trying to look like something other than what it is. There are references in some sources to the Black Dragon's fortress monastery, incorporating bone motifs into its architectural language. Not actual biological material necessarily, but choices in stone and metal that echo the protrusions and ridges of the mutation in the visual vocabulary of the building itself. Archways that mimic the curvature of cranial growths. Columns that suggest the verticality of bone blades growing upward toward the sky. Whether this is pure aesthetics or iconography that carries religious and cultural meaning within the chapter, or simply the natural expression of a community that has spent a very long time thinking about a very specific visual language, it speaks to a chapter that is not ashamed of what it carries. A chapter that has made its peace with its physical reality and built that peace into the foundations of the place it calls home. The relationship between the chapter and the human population of Sanctuary is one of the genuinely interesting and underexplored aspects of the Black Dragon's story. For most Space Marine chapters, the inhabitants of their recruiting world occupy a position somewhere between valued resource and dependent subject, a feudal relationship in many respects, with the chapter in the position of distant lords who make specific demands and offer specific protections in exchange. For the Black Dragons, there is an additional dimension that most other chapters do not have to navigate. The population of Sanctuary lives in close, ongoing proximity to warriors who carry a visible and pronounced mutation in a universe that is deeply suspicious of mutation. Over generations, this has shaped the culture of Sanctuary's inhabitants in particular ways. They are not frightened of the Black Dragons in the way that populations encountering the chapter for the first time might be. They understand, in the way that communities develop understanding of their long-term neighbors through continuous cohabitation, what the Black Dragons are and what they represent. The mutations are not secrets to the people of Sanctuary. They are simply part of the reality of the world they live on. Yes, there is a suggestion in some accounts that the population of Sanctuary has developed its own traditions and mythologies around the chapter's mutation, that the bone growths and draconic appearance of the chapter's warriors have filtered into the folklore and spiritual life of the world's inhabitants in ways that reflect a very particular local culture, that the dragons of Sanctuary's myths are not feared but revered, that the chapter's warriors are understood by their own people not as monsters but as guardians, as protectors, as beings whose strangeness is inseparable from their power and their dedication to the defense of the human community they have claimed as their own. This is, when you consider it in the context of the wider 40K universe, a genuinely unusual and genuinely valuable thing. Was in a universe that overwhelmingly reads mutation as corruption, as taint, as evidence of something fundamentally gone wrong, the people of Sanctuary have arrived at a different interpretation. They have developed a mythology in which difference and power are understood as connected rather than in opposition, in which the warriors who protect them are allowed to be exactly what they are, rather than being expected to conceal or apologize for it. The chapter's internal culture, as it has developed over the centuries, reflects both this homeworld relationship and the broader pressures under which the Black Dragons have always operated. Their traditions are built around the mutation in ways that are unusual, even within the diverse landscape of Space Marine chapter culture. There is a second layer of identity within the chapter, running parallel to the standard rank hierarchy. The campaign honors the kill markings of standard Astartes tradition, that specifically tracks and acknowledges the progression of the mutation in individual warriors. Warriors whose mutations are more pronounced occupy specific categories of recognition within the chapter's internal culture. Recognition that is not about rank or seniority, but about a different kind of distinction. The Dragonclaws are honored not just because they are effective in combat, though they are, but because they embody most completely what the chapter has decided it is. Section 8. Combat Doctrine. How you fight when you are the weapon. Every Space Marine chapter develops a combat doctrine, a way of approaching warfare that reflects its genetic gifts, its accumulated experience, its homeworld culture, and something essential about the character of the Brotherhood. The Ultramarines are defined by their precision, their flexibility, their adherence to the Codex Astartes, as both tactical guide and organizing philosophy. The Blood Angels are famous for their speed and their ferocity in close combat. The Space Wolves fight with a looseness and aggression that reflects a culture built around individual glory and brotherhood rather than institutional structure. The Iron Hands value durability, endurance, and the replacement of flesh with machine, where the machine will serve better. The Black Dragons fight like what they are, warriors who have been shaped, partly by training and partly by biology, into instruments specifically calibrated for close quarters destruction. Their doctrine is built around their mutations capabilities in ways that are direct and unsentimental, and it has been refined over centuries of warfare into something that is genuinely elegant in its brutality, effective in ways that are specifically its own, rather than being a pale imitation of some other chapter's approach. At the most fundamental level, Black Dragon's combat doctrine emphasizes forward movement, closing distance, getting through the kill zones, and inside the effective range of heavy weapons, past the defensive positions where the enemy feels most secure, into the personal space of the opponent, where the bone blades become relevant, and where the psychological weight of what is advancing on you compounds the physical pressure of the assault. Yes, the Black Dragons understand, at an institutional level, that their greatest tactical asset is not simply their firepower or their durability, but their ability to demand the enemy's full attention and then use that attention against them. The Dragon Claws function within the chapter's overall organization, in a role broadly analogous to how other chapters use their close combat specialists, assault marines, vanguard veterans, the dedicated melee formations that almost every chapter maintains in some form. But the Black Dragon version of this role has specific qualities that distinguish it not merely in degree, but in kind from the standard template. Dragon Claws are not simply faster or more aggressive versions of tactical marines. They are something different in their fundamental combat orientation. Built around the specific capabilities of the bone blades and the specific psychological effects of what they look like in combat. Their preferred engagement range is closer than most warriors would deliberately position themselves. Close enough that the bone blades are effective. Close enough that the enemy cannot bring large weapons to bear without risking their own forces. Close enough that the visual reality of what is attacking them is inescapable and intimate. There are accounts of Dragon Claws entering specific types of engagements with their ranged weapons powered down or set aside entirely, choosing to rely entirely on their natural weapons and whatever close combat blades they carry, in addition to their bone growth. This is not the absence of tactical thinking, it is the expression of it. It reflects warriors who have assessed the specific environment, identified the moment where their close combat capabilities will be most effective, and committed to those capabilities in a way that is intentionally absolute. When a Dragon Claw comes at you with empty hands that end in bone blades, you know with complete certainty what is about to happen. That certainty is itself a weapon. The chapter's broader deployment philosophy coordinates the Dragon Claws with the rest of the chapter's forces in patterns designed to create the conditions the Dragon Claws need. Ranged elements suppress enemy positions, create confusion, force enemy commanders to focus their attention on the conventional threat rather than the unconventional one. Vehicles advance in close support, providing cover and additional firepower that keeps the enemy from concentrating on any single element of the assault. And the Dragon Claws use this created space to close, to reach the point where the fighting becomes what they are built for. The chapter's chaplains have an unusually prominent and active role in the Black Dragon's combat preparation. The spiritual dimension of preparing warriors to fight is present in all Space Marine chapters. Chaplains serve this function everywhere in the Adeptus Astartes, but the Black Dragon's pre-battle ceremonies have a specific quality related to the mutation that makes them different from the standard template. These ceremonies, whose details are not widely recorded, Net appear to serve the function of centering the warriors in an understanding of what they are that is explicitly oriented around the mutation, that frames the bone blades and the draconic appearance not as burdens to be carried into battle, but as gifts to be brought to bear. A warrior who goes into battle feeling the weight of his otherness, as shame fights differently from one who goes in understanding that otherness as strength. The chaplains ensure the latter. The chapter also uses its visual presentation with a deliberate tactical sophistication that goes beyond simply appearing frightening. They have studied the specific threat response patterns of the various enemies they face over centuries of warfare, developing an understanding of how different opponents process visual threat information. While human forces respond to the Black Dragon's appearance in ways that can be predicted and exploited, Orc forces respond differently. Orcs are not reliably frightened by things that look threatening. Their threat response tends to produce aggression rather than flight, which means the intimidation dimension of the Black Dragon's capabilities functions differently against them. Chaos forces, whose members are often mutated themselves, have their own specific response patterns. The chapter has learned to calibrate its approach against different enemy types in ways that extract maximum value from what they are. Section 9. Notable characters. The Obsidian Glaive and the chapter in fiction literature is one of the primary vehicles through which Space Marine chapters acquire depth and nuance in the wider world of Warhammer 40,000 fiction. The rules and codexes provide structure. The background material provides history, but it is in the novels and short stories that chapters truly come alive, where characters step forward from the background, where the internal texture of a brotherhood becomes visible, where we get to spend time inside the specific experience of being these particular warriors, rather than simply observing them from outside. For the Black Dragons, the most significant piece of dedicated fiction is the novel The Obsidian Glaive, written by Anthony Reynolds and published as part of the Black Library's Space Marine Battles series. This is the work that more than any other source gave the chapter a detailed interior life. Warriors with names and histories and interior lives, and a narrative that engaged with the chapter's specific tensions in honest and thoughtful ways. A story that treated the Black Dragons not as a visual conceit, but as a community of individuals with something genuine and complex going on beneath the surface. What Reynolds does particularly well in this novel is resist the temptation to resolve the fundamental ambiguity around the Black Dragons in either direction. There is always a temptation in writing about chapters like this to land somewhere comfortable, to either fully vindicate the chapter by revealing that their mutation is completely benign and their loyalty is beyond any reasonable question, or to reveal that the Inquisition's concerns were justified all along and that something genuinely dark lurks at the heart of the chapter. Reynolds declines both options. While the Black Dragons in the Obsidian Glaive are exactly what the chapter should be in the best lore. Warriors who live in a difficult space, who have developed sophisticated strategies for inhabiting that space, and whose story does not resolve cleanly because the questions at the heart of it are not the kind that have clean resolutions. The characters in the novel illuminate different aspects of the chapter's culture with specificity. Veterans whose mutations have progressed over decades of service, bearing the most extreme bone growths and occupying the most specialized roles within the Dragonclaw formations. Younger warriors who are only beginning to develop the external signs of the mutation and who are working through what that means for their identity within the chapter and their relationship to the outside world. Our officers who carry the additional burden of navigating the political reality of inquisitorial scrutiny while trying to maintain operational focus and the morale of their brothers. Chaplains whose ceremonial role gives them a specific and irreplaceable function in the chapter's collective psychological health. Beyond the novel, there are scattered references to Black Dragon characters in short fiction and background material that together build a picture of how the chapter has been understood by the various authors and designers who have worked with them over the years. The consistent thread across these references is the chapter's self-awareness, the quality that comes from existing under sustained scrutiny, or from knowing that you are watched and assessed, and that your every action contributes to the ongoing evaluation of your right to exist. Black Dragon characters in fiction carry this knowledge with them, and it gives them a psychological texture that is specific to them rather than being a generic Astartes quality. There are also references to Black Dragon warriors serving in the Death Watch, the elite inquisitorial formation that draws individual warriors from Space Marine chapters for special operations conducted under the direct authority of the Ordo Xenos. Death Watch service is, for chapters in the Black Dragon's position, one of the most powerful arguments available to them for their continued existence. A warrior who serves the Ordo Xenos, who fights at the direction of an inquisitor, who operates within a framework of direct and continuous inquisitorial oversight, and who completes that service with an honorable record, has demonstrated something about his chapter that no amount of battlefield performance in the chapter's own name can quite replicate. He has demonstrated it in the Inquisition's own house, under the Inquisition's own gaze, by their own standards of assessment. The Black Dragons who have served in the Death Watch and returned have contributed materially to the chapter's accumulated argument for its continued existence. And the chapter values them not just for what they bring back in terms of experience and capability, but for what their service has added to the record. Every completed Death Watch rotation is another data point on the right side of the scales. Section 10. Allies, Enemies, and the Galaxy's verdict on the Black Dragons. In the galaxy of the 41st Millennium, reputation is a kind of infrastructure. It shapes the decisions of allies and enemies before the first shot is fired. It opens some doors and closes others. It creates expectations that can be leveraged or subverted depending on the strategic situation. And for the Black Dragons, reputation is a particularly complex and multi-layered thing, because different audiences in the Imperium have very different responses to what the chapter is and what it represents. Among the Space Marine community more broadly, the Black Dragons occupy a position that is somewhere between respected and uneasily avoided. Other Astartes chapters understand what the Black Dragons are better than the general Imperial military or civilian population does. Space Marines operate in a universe full of extraordinary biological and psychic phenomena, and a chapter with a pronounced os modular mutation is unusual, but not entirely outside the range of things that have been encountered before in the long history of the Adeptus Astartes. The knowledge is there, the understanding, in principle, is there. But the Inquisition's ongoing scrutiny casts a shadow that most other chapters are reluctant to step into. Being closely associated with a chapter under inquisitorial watch, regularly deploying alongside them, maintaining close operational ties, and treating them as trusted brothers in the same way you would treat a chapter with an uncomplicated record, carries its own risks. The association is noticed, it is recorded, it becomes part of the picture that the Inquisition builds of a chapter's relationships and alignments. Most chapters have made the pragmatic decision to maintain correct but not especially warm relations with the Black Dragons, cooperative in specific operational contexts when circumstances require it, available for coordinated deployments when the situation demands combined Space Marine resources, but not eager volunteers for joint operations, not seeking out opportunities to stand publicly beside the Black Dragons in ways that would emphasize the relationship. There are exceptions. Chapters whose own histories include enough unusual elements that some degree of inquisitorial attention is already part of their reality, are sometimes more willing to see the Black Dragons as something other than a liability. The Space Wolves, who have their own set of genetic idiosyncrasies, the Canis Helix, the Wolfen phenomenon, the ongoing tension between their wild culture and what the Codex Astartes considers acceptable, have their own reasons for not throwing stones at chapters dealing with mutation questions. The Blood Angels, carrying the Flaw, that deep genetic shadow that expresses itself in their warriors as the Red Thirst and the Black Rage, know what it is to be a chapter defined partly by a mutation that cannot be controlled and must be managed within the warrior culture of the Brotherhood. These chapters, if not exactly the Black Dragons' close allies, are perhaps less likely to treat the Black Dragons as simply an embarrassment to be distanced from. The Astra Militarum, the ordinary human soldiers of the Imperial Guard, presents its own interesting picture. Guardsmen who have served in extended campaigns alongside the Black Dragons frequently develop genuine respect for them, the respect that soldiers develop for other soldiers who are clearly effective and clearly on the same side. The strangeness becomes familiar over time. The mutations become markers of the warriors fighting beside you rather than threats to be processed. Long-service veterans of campaigns where the Black Dragons were involved tend to speak of them in straightforward terms: capable, aggressive, effective, and, this point comes up repeatedly, committed. Yet the Black Dragons do not hold back. They do not play it safe when the situation calls for forward movement. They commit to the assault with the kind of total physical engagement that the warriors who share a battlefield with them find genuinely impressive. But first, encounters with Black Dragon warriors are consistently noted in accounts as producing significant alarm responses in unprepared guardsmen. Commanding officers of guard formations who have been assigned to operate alongside the Black Dragons without adequate preparation have sometimes found this to be a genuine command challenge. Managing the reactions of soldiers who are experiencing something their threat assessment systems were not calibrated for. On the enemy side, the Black Dragons have accumulated a distinctive operational record across centuries of warfare. Yet their combat doctrine and the specific capabilities of the Dragon Claws mean that their most distinctive engagements have tended to be in close quarters environments: siege warfare, boarding operations, urban fighting, the kind of grinding, personal, brutal combat that occurs when armies close to distances measured in meters rather than kilometers. In these environments, the bone blades are most relevant, and the psychological dimensions of the chapter's appearance are most intensely felt. Against chaos forces, the chapter carries a particular kind of enmity. There have been instances of chaos warbands who have sought out the Black Dragons specifically because of their mutation, who have tried to make the argument that warriors so clearly marked by change should be fighting for a different master. These approaches are, and in the chapter's history, invitations to a demonstration of exactly why they are not corrupt, administered through the medium of bone blades and bolter fire. But they represent a specific quality of pressure that the chapter faces in ways that most other chapters do not. The pressure of being offered a narrative about their mutation that, if accepted, would recontextualize everything about them. The fact that the chapter has repeatedly and decisively rejected this narrative at cost is one of the more compelling arguments for their fundamental orientation. Section 11. The deeper question: loyalty, mutation, and what it means to be human in the 41st millennium. We have been building toward this from the beginning. Through all of it, the gene seed, the mutations, the Inquisition, the combat doctrine, the characters. The combat record. We have been approaching a question that the Black Dragons embody more completely and more uncomfortably than almost any other element of Warhammer 40,000 lore. The Imperium of mankind is built on a very specific idea of what humanity is and what forms of humanity are worth protecting. The Emperor's original vision, before 10,000 years of institutional calcification, transformed it into something he might not fully recognize, was of a humanity that would survive, that would endure the darkness that pressed in from every direction, that would outlast the alien and the demon and the corruption that sought to unmake it. The whole apparatus of the Imperium, the armies, the fleets, the institutions, the faith, the vast hierarchies of power and doctrine, is oriented around this survival imperative. But survival raises an immediate question, and it is a question that the Imperium has never fully and honestly confronted. Survival of what, exactly? Of the biological template? Of the genome in its current form? Of some essential quality that transcends the physical body and persists even through significant physical change? And when the body changes, when the genome mutates, when the physical expression of humanity begins to include things that the original template did not, does the humanity within that changed form survive the change? Or does change itself compromise whatever made the original form worth the effort of preservation? The Imperium has answered these questions in its institutions and its laws in ways that are clear enough. Mutation is suspect. A significant mutation is heretical in all but the most exceptional circumstances. Extreme mutation is a death warrant, full stop, administered without particular concern for the individual circumstances of the mutant in question. The Inquisition's mandate, the doctrines of the ecclesiarchy, the operational philosophy of countless cleansing actions across 10,000 years, all of these point in the same direction. The body matters. The template is not optional. Deviation from it is dangerous and must be treated as such. The Black Dragons are a living argument against this position, not an abstract philosophical argument. They are not philosophers, and they do not present themselves as advocates for anything beyond their continued service. But their existence is itself a kind of argument, in a demonstration pressed across centuries of combat, that the simple equation of mutation with corruption is not a reliable one. That a being can grow bone blades through the skin of its hands, can look in the mirror and see a reflection that does not match the standard human template, and can still be loyal, can still fight for the things that unmutated warriors fight for, can still be, in the most meaningful sense of the word, on the right side. This argument makes the Inquisition profoundly uncomfortable, and that discomfort is worth sitting with for a moment. Because if the Inquisition formally accepts the argument, if it acknowledges explicitly that the Black Dragon's mutation is acceptable, that loyalty can persist through physical change of this magnitude, then it has created a precedent. And precedents matter enormously to institutions that rely on the clarity and authority of their doctrinal positions. If the Black Dragons are fine, where is the line? If the osmodula's external bone growth is permissible, what other kinds of mutation are within the envelope of acceptability? Who decides where the limits are? On what basis is the decision made? And critically, does the logic that protects the Black Dragons extend to the millions of ordinary human mutants scattered across the Imperium who carry their own deviations from the template and who have no centuries of battlefield performance to argue in their favor? The Imperium's answer to these questions is, characteristically, to not answer them at all, to handle each case as it comes with as little precedent setting as possible, and maintaining maximum institutional flexibility, which in practice means maintaining the ability to condemn whatever the Inquisition decides needs condemning at any given moment, without having made any binding commitments that would constrain that condemnation later. The Black Dragons navigate this by not making the philosophical argument explicitly. They do not lobby for a broader re-evaluation of imperial policy on mutation. They do not write treatises. They do not present their case in any form that would require a formal response. They argue through deeds, not words, through the accumulated weight of centuries of service, through the long list of enemies defeated, threats neutralized, worlds defended, and brothers fallen in the Emperor's name. They let the record speak. And they trust that the record will speak loudly enough to be heard over whatever the Inquisition has to say about the shape of their bones. There is something deeply, characteristically Space Marine about this approach. Not analytical, not rhetorical, practical, demonstrative. The empirical argument of warriors who believe that what they do matters more than what they look like. But there is also something more personal in it, something that gets closer to the chapter's actual psychological interior. Because the Black Dragons have not simply decided to be strategically wise about their mutations, they have done something braver and more interesting than that. They have decided to own them, to understand them not as shameful deviations from a norm they are failing to achieve, and not as unfortunate biological accidents that must be apologized for, but as genuine expressions of what the chapter is. The bones that grow through their skin are not mistakes. They are not evidence of failure. They are this chapter's particular face in the Emperor's Grand Army, as individual to the Black Dragons as any other chapter's most defining characteristic, and as worthy of pride as any of those characteristics. This is, in the context of the universe they live in, a profound psychological achievement. To look at what your body does, in a universe that has told you your entire life that what your body does is wrong and dangerous and suspect, and to decide that it is not a curse, but a fact, not a weakness, but a weapon, not a source of shame, but a source of identity. To make that decision not privately, and not as an individual quietly resisting an external judgment, but collectively, as a community of thousands of warriors who have agreed together that this is what they are and they are not going to pretend otherwise. That takes something, and whatever that something is, call it resilience, call it pride, call it the stubbornness of warriors who have decided they will not be diminished by the opinions of others. It is one of the more genuinely admirable qualities in an organization that is populated by admirable qualities. In the context of the larger 40K setting, the Black Dragons function as a story about belonging and identity under sustained institutional pressure, about what it costs to be visibly different in a culture that treats difference as danger, and about the strategies that communities develop for surviving under the gaze of institutions that hold power of life and death over them, about the particular kind of dignity that can be built in communities that have had to construct it without permission from the larger world, that have had to decide for themselves what they are worth. The warriors of the Black Dragons live their entire careers, centuries of service, in some cases, under the knowledge that they are watched, that their survival as a chapter is contingent on calculations that may not always come out in their favor, that the next political shift, the next dogmatic inquisitor, the next unfortunate incident in the wrong place at the wrong time could change everything. They live with this knowledge every day, in every deployment, and they do not collapse under it. And they do not become paranoid or bitter or self-destructive. They remain, through all of it, functional and effective and genuinely loyal. That is extraordinary. It deserves to be recognized as such, even in a universe that has a limited vocabulary for the kind of courage it takes to simply keep going under this particular kind of pressure. Section 12. Final reflection. What the Black Dragons mean and why they still matter. As we come toward the close of this examination, I want to take a moment to collect what we have looked at and reflect on why the Black Dragons specifically are worth this level of sustained attention. Why they are more than an interesting visual concept. Why the story they embody matters in ways that extend beyond their specific place in the lore. First, the genetics. But the mutation the Black Dragons carry is a real and ongoing feature of their existence, not a historical anomaly that was corrected and recorded. The osmodular deviation continues to express itself in new recruits. It continues to grow and develop in serving warriors. It is the chapter's gene seed now, in the fullest possible sense, not something that happened to their founding generation and was then resolved, but something that is continuously produced and continuously present. This ongoing quality gives the chapter's story a weight that it would not have if the mutation were simply historical. It means the question never closes. It means every generation of Black Dragons is born into the same situation as the last, carrying the same question and having to find their own answer to it. Second, the Inquisition relationship. The ongoing negotiated tension between the Black Dragons and the various parties within the Inquisition who have views about them is one of the more realistic portrayals of institutional conflict in the setting. It avoids making the Inquisition simply villainous, and it avoids making the Black Dragons simply victims. Both parties are recognizable as complex institutions with legitimate concerns in tension, and the resolution, such as it is the kind of messy, unresolved, contingent compromise that actual institutional tensions tend to produce in practice. There is no clean ending here. There is just the ongoing negotiation, the ongoing scrutiny, and the ongoing service. Third, the philosophical dimension, which is ultimately where the Black Dragon's real significance lies. They are a sustained challenge to the Imperium's reflex equation of mutation with corruption, a challenge made not in words or formal arguments, but in the accumulated record of centuries of loyal service. The challenge does not resolve the question. It cannot, in the setting and the context. But it keeps the question alive in ways that matter. It insists on the question being asked and asked again, rather than allowing the Inquisition's reflexive answer to stand unchallenged. What does loyalty mean when the institution you are loyal to is not sure whether to trust you? What does it mean to serve faithfully for centuries under the ongoing threat of condemnation? What does it mean to build a community and a culture and a tradition that is genuinely proud of what it is, in the face of everything that says it should not be? The Black Dragons provide a specific and concrete set of answers to these questions, embodied in warriors of bone and black ceramite who go out into the dark and fight for things that are worth fighting for. In the grim darkness of the far future, that is not a small thing. In a setting defined by grinding, relentless, often pointless-seeming conflict, by institutions that have calcified into parodies of their original purposes, by a universe that seems designed to crush the possibility of meaningful choice. In that setting, a chapter that has chosen to be exactly what it is, with full awareness of the cost, and has refused to apologize for it, is doing something that deserves to be noticed. The bone blades grow. The black armor is sealed. The dragon claws advance through the smoke toward whatever comes next out of the dark. The Black Dragons endure. Closing. Thank you for spending time in the dark. And that, wherever you are right now, is the full story of the Black Dragons. One of the strangest, most visually striking, most philosophically rich chapters in all of Warhammer 40,000. A chapter that looks like a nightmare and fights for your survival. A chapter that the Imperium cannot quite decide what to do with, and that has decided, in the meantime, to just keep being indispensable. I hope this gave you something to sit with. Not just about the Black Dragons specifically, but about what the best 40,000 lore does, how it uses the extreme circumstances of the 41st millennium to illuminate things that feel genuinely true about loyalty, about belonging, about identity under pressure. The Black Dragons are a story you can think about for a long time after you have learned the surface details. And the longer you think about them, the more there is to find. If you made it all the way to the end of this one, truly, thank you. This kind of deep dive takes time and care to put together, and knowing that you stayed for all of it, that the story held you from start to finish, that means everything to this channel. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button. It takes 2 seconds, and it helps more than most people realize. It is how this content finds the people who will love it. And if you want to be here when the next one comes out, if you want to keep exploring these quieter corners of 40K where the stories are stranger and deeper and more worth sitting with, then please subscribe. I would genuinely love to have you along for what comes next. Until then, stay in the dark, but do not be afraid of what you find there. Script for Q on 40,000. The Black Dragons, a monstrously mutated loyalist. Chapter in Warhammer 40,000. Expanded section. The 21st Founding's other cursed children and what that context means. Before we move fully away from the question of the cursed founding and the Black Dragon's place within it, it is worth spending a little more time in that context, because the 21st Founding as a whole is one of the stranger and more evocative pieces of background in all of 40K lore. And understanding where the Black Dragons sit within that broader pattern helps illuminate something important about what their mutation is and is not. The Cursed Founding produced a range of chapters whose genetic irregularities went in very different directions. Some of those chapters are relatively well documented in publicly available lore. Others are mysterious to the point of being little more than rumors in the background material. And some, as mentioned earlier, were destroyed so quickly and so thoroughly that they barely left a trace in the records. Among the surviving chapters of the 21st Founding, the Black Dragons are notable for the fact that their mutation is primarily physical and biological, rather than psychological or psychic. This sounds like a distinction without a difference, but it is actually significant in terms of how the Inquisition categorizes and responds to deviations. A chapter whose warriors show signs of unusual psychic activity or whose members develop behavioral patterns suggesting the influence of warp energy, is in a fundamentally different category of concern from a chapter whose warriors grow bone through their skin. The former is a spiritual threat, the latter is a biological one. The Inquisition has different tools for each and different institutional reflexes about how threatening each is. Biological mutation, in the Imperium's formal doctrinal framework, is concerning but is evaluated in terms of its source and its nature. Mutation that can be traced to warp exposure, to chaos corruption, to the influence of the dark powers, that is categorically damnable and treated as such. Mutation that appears to have a purely biological origin, that does not express itself in psychic phenomena, but that does not produce behavioral patterns consistent with corruption, that occupies a grayer zone, not acceptable necessarily, not cause for celebration, but not automatically a death warrant in the same way that warp-sourced mutation is. The Black Dragon's mutation has, through decades of Mechanicus monitoring and inquisitorial assessment, never produced any reliable evidence of warp taint. The bone growths are calcium and phosphate and collagen, the same materials as normal bone, produced by a biological mechanism that is aberrant in its expression, but not obviously supernatural in its nature. There is no psychic resonance associated with the growths. There is no behavioral shift in warriors who develop them that suggests the influence of outside forces. They grow bones, abnormally, externally, and in ways that are alarming and inconvenient and politically complicated, but biologically. That is the Mechanicus's assessment, and it is the assessment that has so far allowed the chapter to remain in existence. This does not mean the Inquisition is satisfied. Satisfied is not a state the Inquisition tends to reach about anything, but it means they have had to work with an evidence base that points away from the cleanest justification for decisive action, and that has been enough, combined with the chapter's battlefield record, to maintain the current uneasy equilibrium. Other cursed founding chapters have not been as fortunate in the nature of their deviations. Some have been destroyed since their founding, not always by the Inquisition, sometimes by their own actions in combat, and sometimes by circumstances that had nothing to do with their mutations. Others persist in conditions of even more severe scrutiny than the Black Dragons face. The Black Dragons are not the most extreme case among the 21st Founding's survivors. They are simply the most visually striking, and in 40K, visual strikingness tends to drive reputation in ways that more subtle deviations do not. There is also a comparative dimension worth considering. Other Ultramarine successor chapters show a range of genetic expressions, most of them stable and compliant with the standard template. The Black Dragon's deviation therefore cannot be attributed to some general instability in the Ultramarine genetic line as a whole. It is specific to the Black Dragons, or at least significantly more pronounced in them than in any other known Ultramarine successor. This specificity raises questions that even the Mechanicus has not satisfactorily answered. Was there something specific about the gene seed cultivation process during this particular founding? Was there a contamination event? Was there deliberate interference by parties with motives that were not disclosed? Or is this simply the expression of latent instability that was always present in some portion of the ultramarine genetic material, waiting for the right combination of factors to express itself? The answer matters enormously, for a specific reason. If the mutation is an artifact of the founding process, something introduced accidentally or deliberately during cultivation, then it is a finite problem. The gene seed carries what it carries, and while it will continue to express the mutation in the warriors it produces, the source is not ongoing. If, on the other hand, the mutation represents an inherent instability in the genetic line that is capable of further development, of becoming more extreme over more generations, of potentially producing expressions that are currently not present, then it is an open question how far the process will go and what it will eventually look like. This is the version of the question that keeps certain Mechanicus adepts awake at night. Not whether the Black Dragons are loyal now. The evidence for that is substantial. But whether what they are now represents a stable endpoint, or whether it is a point on a curve that goes somewhere less comprehensible if followed long enough. Expanded section. The apothecary's role and the impossible task of gene seed management. Within the Black Dragons chapter, the apothecaries occupy a position of unusual importance. In any Space Marine chapter, the apothecaries are crucial figures. They are the warriors responsible for the medical care of their brothers, for the recovery of gene seed from fallen Marines, and for the broader health monitoring that keeps the chapter's biological inheritance intact across generations. They are, in a real sense, the custodians of the chapter's future. In the Black Dragons, the apothecaries carry this standard burden and a great deal more besides. Because the mutation they are tasked with monitoring does not behave the way a stable biological system behaves. And it is not a fixed point on a map that they can document once and refer back to forever. It is a living process, ongoing, expressing itself differently in different warriors, at different rates, over different timelines. Managing it requires continuous, active engagement rather than simple record keeping. The specific challenges the Black Dragons apothecaries face are several and interrelated. First, there is the challenge of documentation, of maintaining accurate, comprehensive records of how the mutation is expressing itself across the entire chapter roster at any given time. Which warriors are developing significant external bone growth? At what rate are the growths progressing? Are there patterns that allow the apothecaries to predict which warriors will develop Dragon Claw level mutations and which will not? Or what are the physical correlates of high versus low mutation expression? Are there other measurable biological parameters that predict the degree of osmodular deviation? Second, there is the challenge of management, of developing practices for supporting warriors through the physical process of the mutation's expression in ways that minimize suffering and maximize functional outcome. The growth of bone through skin is not a comfortable process. It does not happen quickly enough in most cases to be acutely painful in the way that a sudden injury is painful, but it is a persistent and ongoing process that the warrior's body is continuously adapting to, and it requires monitoring to ensure that it does not produce complications that compromise the warrior's effectiveness. And the apothecaries have developed specific protocols for this, ways of supporting the growth process, of managing the tissue around emergence points, of assessing whether any given protrusion is developing in a direction that will be functionally useful or that will need to be redirected. Third, and most politically sensitive of all, there is the challenge of gene seed quality assurance. In a context where the Mechanicus is actively monitoring the gene seed, and where a significant deviation in that monitoring data could trigger formal proceedings that the chapter has every reason to avoid. The apothecaries must maintain records that are honest enough to satisfy the Mechanicus's monitoring requirements, while being careful enough in their framing and presentation that they do not provide material for the worst-case inquisitorial interpretations. This is a delicate balance. It requires not just technical skill, but political judgment, and the chapter's apothecaries tend to be selected partly for exactly that quality. There is also the ongoing responsibility of harvesting and preserving gene seed from fallen Black Dragon warriors, a responsibility that has specific complications in this chapter that it does not have in most others. The gene seed of a Black Dragon warrior carries the mutation. It will produce the mutation in any warrior who receives it as part of a future founding or as part of the chapter's own ongoing recruitment. The apothecaries must manage this fact within the chapter's own practices, and must report on it to the Mechanicus in ways that are accurate without being unnecessarily alarming. The relationship between the Black Dragon's apothecaries and the Mechanicus representatives who conduct their periodic gene seed assessments is one of the more interesting inter-institutional dynamics in the chapter's story. These assessments are mandated and cannot be refused. Refusing would itself be a serious provocation, but they can be shaped in terms of what the assessors see and how the information is presented. The Black Dragon's apothecaries have become, over generations, as skilled practitioners of the art of presenting difficult information in the most neutral and least alarming possible framing. This is not deception. The data is accurate. But data does not interpret itself, and the framing of an assessment can make the difference between a report that concludes ongoing monitoring recommended and one that concludes immediate further investigation warranted. Expanded section. The warrior's inner experience. What it feels like to be a black dragon. One of the dimensions of the black dragons that fiction can explore more readily than background material can is the interior experience of the warriors themselves. What does it feel like to be a black dragon? To grow up in the chapter's culture, to develop the mutation, to inhabit a body that is doing something unusual even by Space Marine standards, and to serve under the shadow of inquisitorial scrutiny. What is the psychological texture of daily life in this particular brotherhood? The recruits who join the Black Dragons come, as with most chapters, from the human population of their homeworld. They are young, typically adolescent, by the time the selection process begins, old enough to have developed the physical and psychological qualities that the chapter is looking for, but young enough that their bodies are still capable of undergoing the profound transformations the implantation process requires. They come from a world whose culture already includes the Black Dragons as a fundamental feature of its reality, where the Marines and their mutations are known quantities, yet understood and incorporated into the local mythology in ways that have been developing for as long as the chapter has been on Sanctuary. This means that unlike recruits from worlds where the Space Marine chapter is a distant, semi-mythological presence, young people from Sanctuary grow up with a more complex and more realistic picture of what they might be becoming. They have seen Black Dragon warriors, they have seen the mutations, they have heard the stories not just of glory in battle, but of the political complications, the watchfulness required, the specific kind of life that service in this particular chapter involves. The Black Dragons of Sanctuary are not romanticized fantasies to the young people who aspire to join them, but they are known quantities in a way that generates a different kind of aspiration, one that is more clear-eyed and more prepared for the specific reality rather than the generic, heroic fantasy. Once accepted, and through the early stages of the implantation process, recruits begin the long training that will shape them into warriors. The Black Dragon's training follows the standard Space Marine template in broad outline, but has specific elements that are unique to the chapter. Training in the management of the mutation is integrated into the program from early on, not because recruits have necessarily developed significant external growths yet, but because the chapter understands the value of preparation. Warriors who know what to expect when the mutation begins to express itself more dramatically, who have been given the cultural and practical framework for understanding it as something to manage rather than something to fear or hide, are warriors who will integrate the experience more smoothly into their identity and their function. The development of the bone growths, when it occurs, is a process that the chapter treats as significant, not as a problem or a crisis, but as a transition, a point in the warrior's development that marks a change in his relationship to the chapter and to himself. Warriors who begin to develop significant external growths are given additional attention from the chapter's specialists, are introduced more formally to the traditions and practices around bone blade management, and are gradually oriented toward the role that the Dragon Claws represent. For warriors in whom the mutation progresses dramatically, this transition is a genuinely important passage in their career, a moment that is recognized and honored within the chapter's culture in ways that the outside world is not invited to observe. The experienced Dragonclaw, the warrior who has been living with the bone blades for decades, has arrived at a relationship with his mutation that is worth understanding. He has had long enough to move through whatever stages of adjustment the process required, whatever initial strangeness, whatever processing of the cultural and political implications of what his body is doing, and to arrive at something closer to integration. The bone blades are his. They are part of him in a way that is not separate from his identity as a warrior, but continuous with it. Yet they are not tools he puts on in the morning and removes at night. They are there always, growing, sharpening with maintenance, present in every physical interaction with the world. This continuous physical presence of the mutation in the warrior's daily life creates a specific kind of relationship between body and identity that most Space Marine warriors, for all their differences from ordinary humans, do not have to navigate. The ordinary Astartes' body is extraordinary, but it is extraordinary in ways that are largely interior. The enhanced muscles, the reinforced bones, the extra organs, the altered metabolism. The externally expressed mutation of the black dragons is different. It is present in the mirror. It is visible to anyone who sees the warrior without his armor. It changes how the warrior interacts physically with the world, because the bone blades are there during everything, not just during battle. The psychological result of this continuous presence is, by all accounts, a particular quality of self-possession, a groundedness in physical reality that the chapter's warriors develop through long years of inhabiting bodies that are unambiguously, visibly, and permanently their own particular kind of different. They know what they are. There is no possibility of forgetting it or of pretending otherwise. And through long familiarity, through the cultural framework the chapter provides for understanding and honoring the mutation, most Black Dragon warriors reach a point where this knowledge is simply part of who they are, rather than something they are continuously managing or processing. This is not complacency. They remain aware of the Inquisition's interest, and aware of how the chapter is viewed by much of the broader Imperium, aware of the specific considerations that govern how they present themselves to the outside world. But they carry this awareness without being defined by it. The inner life of a Black Dragon warrior is not the inner life of someone constantly performing an identity for an external audience. It is the inner life of someone who has arrived at genuine self-understanding and built a professional and personal identity on that foundation. Expanded section. What the chapter's victories have looked like across history. It would be easy to spend all of our time with the Black Dragons, focusing on the mutation and its implications, and to lose sight of the fact that this is, ultimately, a chapter defined by what it does rather than simply by what it is. The Black Dragons are warriors. Their history is a history of warfare, and while the specific details of many of their campaigns are not documented in publicly available lore with the same depth as, say, the Ultramarines' extensive battle record, the broad strokes of the kinds of fights the chapter has been involved in are worth understanding. The Black Dragons have been deployed, over their history, against a range of enemies that spans almost the full catalogue of the Imperium's threats. Orc incursions, where their close combat capabilities have been put to the test against enemies who are themselves ferociously capable in melee. Chaos, warband incursions, where the psychological dimension of their appearance interacts in complex ways with opponents who are themselves marked by mutation and corruption. Xenos raids of various kinds are heretic forces, the kind of grinding, world by world, century by century attrition of the Imperium's endless wars that makes up the bulk of any Space Marine chapter's operational history. What stands out across this history is not any single legendary engagement, though there are records of significant battles in the chapter's past, but the pattern of consistency. The Black Dragons show up. They fight. They do not perform at below standard levels. They do not produce the kind of outcomes that would give the Inquisition grounds for intervention based on operational failure or suspected corruption, rather than genetic deviation. The battles they fight, they tend to win. The worlds they defend, they tend to hold. The specific quality of victory they produce tends to be messy and close and personal in ways that reflect their combat doctrine. But it is victory, consistently, across centuries of service. This consistency is the most important single fact about the Black Dragon's relationship with the institutions that watch them. Because the Inquisition, for all the doctrinal weight it carries, is also operating within an Imperium that needs to be defended, and that defense requires effective military assets. A chapter that produces consistently strong operational outcomes, that deploys effectively to the theaters that need it, and that does not produce the kind of catastrophic failures that would justify the enormous cost and disruption of formal dissolution proceedings. That chapter has a functional argument for its existence that is hard to argue against, however uncomfortable its appearance or genetics might be. But the Black Dragons have understood this from early in their history, and they have made a collective, institutional commitment to never giving the watching eyes a reason to change their assessment. Not through concealment, not through performance, through actual, consistent effectiveness delivered over time in the only way that actually counts, by fighting well, by winning, and by doing so in the Emperor's name without equivocation. Expanded section. The chapter's relationship with the broader Adeptus. Astartes and what it means for the future. The Black Dragons exist within the broader context of the Adeptus Astartes as a whole, and their particular position within that context raises some interesting questions about how the institution of the Space Marines handles its internal diversity, and about what might be coming in the long term. So the Adeptus Astartes is, in theory, a unified institution. All Space Marine chapters serve the Emperor. All draw their genetic heritage from the Primarchs. All follow, to varying degrees, the organizational and doctrinal guidance of the Codex Astartes. This shared foundation is meant to create a coherent force that can operate across the vast distances of the Imperium with reasonable predictability and mutual intelligibility between chapters. In practice, of course, the Adeptus Astartes is considerably more diverse than this ideal suggests. Chapters diverge from the Codex in significant ways. They develop independent cultures, independent doctrines, independent relationships with the institutions around them. They accumulate their own histories and their own identities, and over centuries of separation from their founding chapter, they become genuinely distinct organizations rather than simply regional variants of the same essential thing. The Black Dragons represent an extreme version of this divergence. Extreme not in the degree of their cultural independence from the ultramarine template, but in the degree to which their biological reality has diverged from the standard. And this raises a question about the institution as a whole that is not comfortable to sit with for very long. If the Black Dragon's gene seed can drift this far from the ultramarine standard while remaining in the loyal, a functional end of the operational spectrum, while producing warriors who are indisputably effective and indisputably oriented toward the right things, then what does that tell us about the Imperium's ability to distinguish between harmless biological divergence and actually dangerous corruption? The monitoring systems, the gene seed assessments, the inquisitorial scrutiny, all of these are designed to catch the problem before it becomes catastrophic. But the Black Dragons are evidence that something can slip through those systems, or that the systems can classify something as acceptable that previous generations would have condemned outright. Whether that is a good thing or a bad thing depends entirely on who you are and what you believe about mutation, about loyalty, and about the nature of the threats the Imperium faces. There is no clean answer. There is only the ongoing question, embodied in black ceramite and growing bone, marching to war for the 1000th time in the Emperor's name. What the long-term future holds for the Black Dragons is, of course, unknown in the lore. The mutation may continue to express itself at roughly current levels indefinitely. It may intensify over further generations of gene seed propagation. It may encounter some biological ceiling beyond which the os modular's activity cannot practically go and stabilize there. Or it may, at some point, produce an expression so extreme that even the most pragmatic assessment can no longer make the case for continued toleration. These possibilities are all open. The Black Dragons live with all of them. They do not pretend to know which future is coming. Yet they simply continue to do what they have always done: fight, endure, maintain their loyalty, sharpen their bones, and trust that the record they are building will be enough. It has been enough so far. And in the darkness of the 41st millennium, so far is the only measure that matters. Expanded section. The quiet dignity of endurance. Why the Black Dragons deserve more attention than they get. There is a particular kind of Space Marine chapter that tends to get overlooked in the broader conversation about 40,000 lore. Not the chapters that are famous for being dark or edgy in the most immediately accessible ways. Those get plenty of attention, and they earn it. Not the chapters whose visual designs are so immediately striking that they become iconic almost independent of their lore. Not the chapters whose connections to the central narrative of 40,000 place them in the spotlight of major events and major publications. The chapters that get overlooked tend to be the ones whose most interesting qualities are not the most immediately legible ones. The ones where you have to spend time before the depth becomes apparent. The ones where the surface presentation, a color scheme, a mutation, a brief codex entry, hints at something deeper without fully revealing it, and where the reward for paying sustained attention is considerably greater than what a casual glance provides. The Black Dragons are exactly that kind of chapter. They have a striking visual identity: the black armor, the bone growths, the draconic helm modifications. That visual identity is immediately memorable and draws people in. But the chapter that lies beneath that visual identity is richer and more complex and more interesting than the visuals alone communicate. And it rewards the kind of sustained engagement that this script has tried to provide. What the Black Dragons offer, when you really spend time with them, is a window into one of 40K's most persistently interesting questions. The question of what loyalty actually looks like when it is tested not by an immediate and obvious temptation, the offer of power from a chaos entity, the promise of survival in exchange for betrayal, but by the slow, grinding, chronic pressure of institutional suspicion. By being told, repeatedly and by powerful voices, that what you are is inherently suspect, that your body is evidence against you, that the mutation you carry means you can never be fully trusted, no matter what you do. Most stories about loyalty in 40K are stories about dramatic moments of choice. A warrior faces the dark and chooses the light. A chapter faces corruption and fights back. The loyalty is demonstrated in an event, a battle, a decisive moment that can be pointed to and celebrated. The Black Dragon's loyalty is demonstrated in the accumulation of ordinary moments, in showing up to the next deployment, in fighting the next battle, in maintaining the next warrior's bone blades with the same care and craft that the warrior before him had, in sitting through the next Mechanicus gene seed assessment and presenting the data honestly, in the most neutral framing available, and then going back to work, or in watching another Inquisitor look at you with that particular expression, the one that says, "I am not convinced you are safe," and doing nothing in response except continuing to be exactly what you are, which is loyal and effective, and not going anywhere. That kind of loyalty is quieter than the dramatic kind. It does not translate easily into art or stories or codex entries that make someone's pulse quicken. But it is, arguably, more meaningful, because it is sustained, because it is chosen, day by day, in the absence of any immediate crisis that demands a choice, in the presence of a chronic pressure that would justify, if anything were to justify it, a very different response. The Black Dragons have chosen endurance, and endurance, in the context of everything they carry, is not a small thing. Expanded section on dragon helms. Iconography and the language the chapter speaks to the galaxy. We have spoken at length about the bone growths and about the tactical deployment of the dragon claws, but there is one more dimension of the Black Dragon's visual and cultural identity that deserves its own careful attention before we close. The deliberate iconographic language the chapter has built around its mutation, and what that language communicates to different audiences. Every Space Marine chapter has an iconography, a set of visual symbols used on armor, on vehicles, on the chapter's banner and its battle fleet that communicate something about what the chapter is. The Ultramarines symbol is clean and geometric, the kind of symbol that says order, precision, authority. The Blood Angel's imagery draws on sacred imagery, on the winged figure of the angel, as on the chalice that represents both sacred blood and the particular tragedy of their genetic curse. The Space Wolves draw on the imagery of their homeworld and their culture. Wolves, runes, the visual vocabulary of a people who understand themselves as hunters and predators in a cold and unforgiving world. The Black Dragon's iconography is built entirely around the mutation. The dragon itself, the chapter's namesake, is the central figure. And the way the dragon is rendered in Black Dragon iconography is specific. Not the heraldic dragon of old Earth medieval tradition, stylized and distant. Not the fantastical dragon of pre-imperial mythology, breathing fire in bright colors. The Black Dragon's dragon is angular, skeletal, defined by bone and spines and sharp edges rather than by flesh and scales. It looks like what you would get if you tried to render a dragon using only the kinds of structures that grow out of a Black Dragon warrior's skull and hands. It is their mutation given mythological form, turned into an icon that can be placed on a banner or embossed on a shoulder plate and read by anyone who sees it as a declaration. The chapter's vehicles bear this iconography as well, and the way it sits on armored surfaces is worth considering. On a Space Marine vehicle, iconography is not decoration, it is identity. It tells the enemy what is coming for them, and it tells your own forces what they are part of. The Black Dragon's vehicle livery takes the black and bone color scheme of the warriors themselves and amplifies it at scale. Large vehicles in black ceramite with bone-colored iconography are striking objects on any battlefield. They read as something older and more dangerous than a simple war machine. They look like something that belongs to a predator, to something that has been built or has grown for a specific and terrible purpose. The chapter's chaplains, whose ceremonial role includes the maintenance and transmission of the chapter's iconographic and cultural traditions, have over the centuries developed an elaborate symbolic vocabulary around the mutation that goes beyond what is visible in official depictions of the chapter. The internal symbolic language of the Black Dragons, the way they talk about the bone growths in their ceremonies, the specific ways in which the dragon claws are honored within the Brotherhood. Yet the traditions around significant milestones in a warrior's mutation development, none of this is documented in sources accessible to the general public or to the Inquisition. It lives within the chapter, transmitted from chaplain to chaplain, and from veteran to initiate, kept alive by the simple practice of continuing to use it. This is one of the small, quiet acts of cultural preservation that Space Marine chapters practice, often without fully recognizing it as preservation. The traditions that are most alive within a chapter's culture are not usually the ones that are written down and archived. They are the ones that are practiced, that are performed in ceremonies and repeated in informal settings, that are learned by newcomers through participation rather than through documentation. Yet the Black Dragon's internal cultural life, the part of it that is not visible to outside observers, is probably the richest and most developed aspect of their identity, and it is also the part that is least accessible to the Inquisition's monitoring. Whether this is deliberate institutional caution or simply the natural development of a living culture that does not particularly feel the need to document itself for external audiences, is probably a question without a clean answer. The Black Dragons are sophisticated enough that the distinction between the two is not always clear, even from the inside. What is clear is that the cultural life they have built, the traditions around the mutation, the ceremonial acknowledgement of its expression in individual warriors, the iconographic language that turns the bone growths into something sacred rather than something shameful, is doing real and important work in sustaining the chapter's psychological health across centuries of service under difficult conditions. Cultures that have been told they are wrong, told that what makes them distinct is a defect, have a choice about how to respond to that message. The Black Dragons have chosen to build their own meaning, to define for themselves what their distinction represents, and to maintain that self-definition with the same stubborn persistence that they bring to holding a battle line. Expanded section. A final meditation on bone and belief. There is one last thing I want to sit with before we close the chapter on the Black Dragons. And it is the most personal dimension of their story. The dimension that connects what they are to something that resonates beyond the specific context of the 41st millennium. The Black Dragons are warriors of faith, not in a simple or uncomplicated way. Faith in the 40,000 universe is never simple or uncomplicated. But the Emperor, in the traditions and beliefs that Space Marine chapters maintain about him, represents something beyond a political authority or a military commander. He represents the possibility of humanity enduring, of the light persisting against the dark, of meaning surviving in a universe that is, by any objective measure, enormously indifferent to whether any particular community of beings survives or flourishes or finds purpose. The Black Dragons hold this faith under specific and unusual conditions, and they hold it in a chapter that their own institution views with suspicion. They hold it in bodies that produce visible evidence of genetic divergence from the human template that the Emperor is understood to have established and valued. They hold it while warriors who look like them, who carry mutations that in some ways resemble theirs, are being hunted and destroyed by the same institution in whose name the Black Dragons fight. And they hold it without apparent crisis, without the fractures and heresies and spirals toward corruption that you might expect, given the pressure. They hold it because they have found a way to understand their mutation that is compatible with their faith, rather than in contradiction to it. They have decided that what their bones do is not evidence against the Emperor's plan for them, but part of it. They have decided that their particular shape of service, the black armor, the bone blades, the draconic silhouette advancing through smoke and ruin, is as valid an expression of devotion as any other. This might seem like a rationalization. It might seem like the kind of logic that warriors develop to justify continuing to do what they were going to do anyway, dressed up in the language of faith to give it respectability. But rationalization and genuine belief are not always easy to distinguish, and the test of belief is not whether it is logically derived, but whether it produces a consistent orientation over time. The Black Dragons have been oriented consistently toward the Emperor's service for as long as they have existed. Whatever the intellectual structure underneath that orientation, the orientation itself is real. And the bone blades grow because the os modular says they must grow. The warriors serve because they have chosen to serve. The chapter endures because it has decided to endure. These are not the same kind of thing, and the distinction between them matters enormously. The bones have no choice in what they do. The warriors do, and the warriors have chosen, generation after generation, in full knowledge of the alternatives available to them, and in full awareness of the cost, to keep going. That is not nothing. In the grim darkness of the far future, where choice is one of the rarest and most precious things in the galaxy, a community of warriors who choose their loyalty clearly and continuously and without self-deception is something worth noticing, something worth honoring, something worth knowing about.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any. And yeah, sleep well.